In the autumn of 1979, two of the wealthiest men in America were quietly doing something that had never been done before. They were trying to steal the world's silver, not with guns, not with fraud exactly, not yet, not according to them. They were doing it through the markets, through futures contracts and vault deliveries and a network of partners stretching from Texas to Saudi Arabia. They were buying silver, all of it they could find, more than anyone had ever bought before. And for a while, it was working. This is the story of Nelson Bunker Hunt and William Herbert Hunt, the story of the most audacious commodity play in the history of modern finance, the story of Silver Thursday, the story of how two men very nearly brought down the American banking system on a single afternoon in March 1980, and the story of how the world's most powerful financial regulators changed the rules of the game specifically to stop them, and what happened when the music stopped. Part 1. The Man Who Built the Fortune. To understand the Hunt brothers, you have to understand their father, Haroldson Lafayette. Hunt was one of the most extraordinary men America has ever produced, and one of the most eccentric. He was born in 1889 in Ramsey, Illinois, the youngest of 8 children. His formal education ended in the 5th grade. He spent years as a drifter and a gambler, traveling through the South and the West, surviving on his wits and his cards. He was, by his own account, one of the finest poker players in any room he entered. That skill, reading people, calculating odds, betting large when the odds were right, defined everything that followed. In 1930, Hunt was in Arkansas, nearly broke, when he heard about a wildcatter in East Texas who had found oil but was running out of money. The wildcatter's name was Columbus Marion Joyner, known to everyone as Dad Joyner, a 69-year-old dreamer who had been drilling dry holes in East Texas for years, convinced he had found a geological formation that others had missed. He had spent years borrowing money from friends, neighbors, and anyone he could convince, selling fractional interests in leases he could barely afford to maintain. His investors were getting impatient, his creditors were circling, and his equipment was breaking down in the field. H.L. Hunt drove to meet him. What followed was one of the most remarkable negotiations in the history of American business. Hunt paid Joyner approximately $30,000 in cash and deferred payments, an amount that seems trivial today, but represented real money in Depression-era Arkansas for Joyner's interests in the East Texas leases. Hunt did not do this blindly. He had studied the geology. He had talked to the drilling crews. He had a gambler's instinct for when the odds were in his favor, and he believed they were. On October 3rd, 1930, the Daisy Bradford No. 3 well struck oil. Not ordinary oil, an ocean of it. What became known as the East Texas oil field proved to be the largest oil deposit in the continental United States at the time. At its peak, it produced over 1 million barrels of oil per day. Hunt had bought into it for $30,000. Within a few years, he had leveraged that position into one of the largest private oil fortunes in American history. By the 1950s, he was believed by some observers to be the wealthiest private citizen in the United States, possibly in the world. His personal eccentricities were as legendary as his wealth. He ate lunch from a brown paper bag that he brought from home every day, even when he could have bought the restaurant. He was suspicious of banks and distrustful of institutions. He had a deep, almost physical aversion to debt. an irony that would reverberate through his son's story decades later. He also had a strong, almost compulsive need for secrecy. The multiple families were perhaps the most extreme expression of this. But even in his business dealings, Hunt operated behind layers of corporations, trusts, and arrangements designed to obscure his true financial position from anyone who might seek to learn it. He was also quietly living double lives. Hunt had 3 families. His first wife, Lyda Bunker, gave him 6 children. While still married to Lyda, he fathered 4 more children with a woman named Frania Tai in a secret second household. And after Lyda's death in 1955, he fathered 3 more children with Ruth Ray, whom he had been seeing for years, and eventually married. When H.L. Hunt died in November 1974, he left behind an estate worth an estimated $2 billion, enormous even by today's standards, spread across children and family members from at least 3 families, in a will of extraordinary complexity. Among his heirs, 2 sons from his first family would come to define the next chapter: Nelson Bunker Hunt and William Herbert Hunt. Part 2. The Sons. Nelson Bunker Hunt was the eldest son, the one everyone watched. He was a large man, physically imposing, 6 feet tall and heavy, with a jovial demeanor and an appetite for risk that made even his father seem cautious. He had already made fortunes and lost some of them. In Libya, Bunker had been part of an enormous oil discovery in the early 1960s. After Muammar Gaddafi seized power and nationalized foreign oil assets in 1973, Bunker lost the Libyan concession and reportedly more than $1 billion in proven reserves. He sued Libya. He lost. The experience hardened him. It also taught him something. Paper assets, assets denominated in currencies controlled by governments, could be taken from you. They could be inflated away, nationalized, devalued by political decisions made in foreign capitals you had no influence over. Hard assets were different. Physical commodities, oil, gold, land, silver, were real. You could hold them. You could store them. A government could not print more silver. It could not devalue silver with a press conference. This was not a new idea. Investors have always turned to hard assets in times of inflation and political instability. But Bunker Hunt was about to take this idea further than anyone had gone before. William Herbert Hunt, quieter, more reserved, always somewhat in his older brother's shadow, would follow where Bunker led. Part 3. The inflation problem. To understand why the Hunts chose silver, you need to understand America in the 1970s. It was an era defined by a crisis that most people today have never experienced: stagflation. The simultaneous occurrence of high inflation, high unemployment, and stagnant economic growth. The combination was supposed to be impossible according to prevailing economic theory. Then it happened. In 1971, President Richard Nixon made a unilateral decision that changed the global financial order. He closed the gold window. He ended the system established at Bretton Woods in 1944, under which the US dollar was directly convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies were pegged to the dollar. The dollar was pegged to gold. The whole structure depended on that anchor. When Nixon ended it, the anchor was gone. Currencies were now floating. The dollar, freed from the constraint of gold convertibility, could be, and was, printed more freely. Between 1970 and 1980, the purchasing power of the US dollar fell by approximately 50%. Inflation averaged over 7% per year for the decade, with peaks above 13% in 1979 and 1980. If you had $1 million in 1970, It bought about $500,000 worth of goods by 1980. The wealthy were watching this happen in real time, and some of them were furious. Nelson Bunker Hunt was among the most vocal. He made no secret of his contempt for what he saw as government destruction of the dollar's value. He reportedly told associates that a man is a fool to hold his assets in paper money. He began buying silver in 1973. At the time, silver was trading at approximately $3 to $4 per troy ounce. It had been held at that level for years by the Bretton Woods system, by government sales, and by a market that had not yet absorbed the implications of the inflation that was beginning to build. Bunker and William began accumulating, quietly at first, then with increasing aggressiveness. By 1974, they had accumulated approximately 55 million ounces, roughly 1,700 metric tons of physical silver, plus substantial futures positions. The buying itself moved the market. Silver climbed from around $3 to nearly $6 by early 1974. And then, crucially, something happened that almost stopped the whole campaign before it truly began. The commodity exchanges noticed the concentration. COMEX began limiting forward sales. Some regulators started asking questions about the nature of the Hunt position. Under this early pressure, and concerned that they had attracted too much attention, the Hunts largely liquidated their futures positions in 1974 and sold down their physical holdings. Silver prices fell back. But Bunker Hunt had learned something from this first campaign. He had learned that a position of this size, if known, if visible, if clearly attributable to a single buyer, would attract regulatory attention and exchange interference. The key to the second campaign would be structure. It would be partners. It would be layers of entities that diffuse the visible concentration of ownership, and it would require allies with deep enough pockets to share the capital risk across a wider base. The Saudi partners he found over the following years were exactly what he needed. But Bunker was not finished. He was watching, planning, and by 1979, he was ready to go much, much bigger. Part 4. The second campaign. The Hunts' second attempt at cornering the silver market was different from the first in scale and in structure. This time, they had partners. Through a complex series of arrangements, the Hunts connected with a group of wealthy Saudi Arabian businessmen, including Mahmoud Fustok and associates of Mohammed Aboud al-Amoudi. Together, they formed a consortium that operated under the umbrella of something called the International Metals Investment Company, or IMIC. The reason for the partnership was partly about capital. Cornering a global commodity market requires extraordinary financial firepower, and partly about discretion. The Hunts understood that their buying would move markets. The more they could diffuse the identity of the buyers, the longer they could accumulate before the market understood what was happening. Beginning in mid-1979, the consortium began buying silver in earnest. Not just physical silver, though they took physical delivery of tens of millions of troy ounces, storing silver in vaults in Switzerland and the United States, and eventually even chartered aircraft to fly silver bars from New York to Switzerland to avoid reporting requirements. They also took massive positions in silver futures contracts. The financial instruments traded on the commodity exchange in New York, known as COMEX, and the Chicago Board of Trade. A futures contract is an agreement to buy a certain amount of a commodity at a certain price at a future date. If you control enough futures contracts and you have the financial firepower to actually take delivery, to demand the physical commodity when the contract expires, you can create enormous pressure on sellers who do not have the physical metal to deliver. This is the mechanism of a corner. You buy so much of a commodity, both physical and through futures, that anyone who has sold it to you short cannot find enough of it to deliver. They must come to you to buy it back, and you name the price. By the autumn of 1979, the Hunts and their associates held futures positions equivalent to hundreds of millions of troy ounces of silver on top of their physical holdings. The total position, by some estimates, represented approximately 1/3 of the world's above-ground silver supply, excluding silver held by governments. Think about that. 1/3 of all the silver in private hands on Earth, controlled by a small group of investors operating out of Texas and the Middle East. Part 4b, the physical silver operation. What made the Hunt operation particularly extraordinary was not just the scale of their futures positions, but the physical silver they were accumulating. Most commodity investors, even large ones, rarely take physical delivery. They hold paper contracts, roll them over when they expire, and never actually touch the underlying commodity. The point is, financial exposure to price movements, not the logistical challenge of storing millions of tons of metal. The Hunts were different. They wanted the metal. Their reasoning was the same reasoning that had driven their original investment thesis. Paper could be taken from you. Futures contracts could be cancelled by exchange rule changes. But physical silver in a vault was something you owned, something tangible, something that governments could not simply devalue with a printing press. So as they accumulated futures positions, they also took physical delivery on an extraordinary scale. Silver bars, each weighing roughly 1,000 troy ounces, roughly 32 kilograms, arrived at storage facilities in Switzerland and in the United States. The Hunts had accounts with major precious metal storage companies in Zurich and Geneva. They were, at various points, among the largest customers these facilities had ever had. The logistics of moving this much physical silver became a challenge of its own. At one point in late 1979, when the Swiss storage facilities were running short of capacity, the Hunts chartered private aircraft to transport silver bars across the Atlantic. Commercial flights could not handle the weight or the insurance requirements. Chartered cargo planes flew pallets of silver from New York to Zurich, week after week. The cost of the storage, the insurance, the transportation, all of it ran into tens of millions of dollars on its own, separate from the purchase price of the metal itself. And still, they bought more. By the peak of their accumulation in early 1980, the Hunts and their Saudi partners, through IMIC, held approximately 100 million troy ounces of physical silver, plus futures contracts representing additional hundreds of millions of ounces. 100 million troy ounces. That is approximately 3,100 metric tons of silver. For context, total global silver production in a typical year in 1979 was approximately 350 to 400 million troy ounces. The Hunts controlled roughly a quarter of a year's entire global production of silver, not in contracts, but in bars sitting in actual vaults. The market was not just being squeezed, it was being held. Part 4c. The reaction on Wall Street. By the autumn of 1979, the professional trading community was well aware that something unusual was happening in silver. The price movements were too consistent, too directional, too resistant to the kind of normal volatility that characterized commodity markets. Professional traders who studied volume and open interest the number of outstanding contracts were seeing patterns that pointed unmistakably to a single dominant buyer. The whisper networks of Wall Street, the trader lunches, the broker phone calls, the industry gossip that circulates through the financial district faster than any published report, were full of a single name: Hunt. This created a peculiar dynamic. Professional investors knew a corner was in progress. Many of them chose to ride the momentum rather than fight it. If a huge buyer was driving up the price, why not buy ahead of them, profit from the move, and sell before the inevitable collapse? This amplified the price moves. Speculators piled into silver from all directions, some attracted by the fundamental inflation argument, some simply chasing the trend, some trying to front-run the Hunt accumulation. The general public also discovered silver. Americans who had been watching inflation erode their savings for a decade suddenly saw a commodity that was rising in price week after week. Television news ran stories about silver as an inflation hedge. Financial commentators began recommending it. Ordinary people went to coin shops and jewelry stores and bought silver with savings they had originally intended for bank accounts. This retail wave added further fuel to the price. By December 1979, people across America were selling their family silver. Silverware, candlesticks, trays, serving dishes that had been passed down for generations, to dealers who were paying record prices for scrap silver. The New York Times reported lines outside precious metals dealers stretching around the block. The country was experiencing a silver fever that had not been seen since the California silver rushes of the 19th century. And sitting at the center of this frenzy, largely invisible to the public, were the Hunt brothers and their partners, quietly, methodically, continuing to accumulate. Part 5. The price moves. Silver entered 1979 at approximately $6 per troy ounce. Then the Hunt Consortium began their aggressive accumulation in earnest. July 1979, silver crosses $8. August 1979, $10. September 1979, $15. October 1979, $17. November 1979, $20. December 1979, $25. And in January 1980, silver reached its all-time peak, $49.45 per troy ounce. In less than 12 months, the price of silver had increased by approximately 800%. Jewelers across America were melting down family heirlooms to sell the silver. Restaurants were selling their silverware. People who had held silver for decades suddenly found themselves holding something that had multiplied in value almost beyond belief. Inflation was indeed a real problem. But this was not inflation. This was a corner, a manufactured crisis. The silver market was being systematically controlled by a small group of buyers with unlimited appetite and access to cheap credit. And Wall Street was beginning to notice. The commodity exchanges, COMEX, and the Chicago Board of Trade were watching with growing alarm. The scale of the Hunt position was extraordinary. The daily volumes passing through their futures markets were being distorted by single players holding positions of unprecedented size. Trading firms, banks, and smaller commodity brokers who had sold silver short, who had made bets that silver prices would fall or remain stable, were facing catastrophic losses. They had sold contracts promising to deliver silver they could not find. The price had not just risen, it had run away from them. They were trapped, and the Hunts, at least for a few months, were extraordinarily rich. Part 6. The rules change. When markets cannot contain a player, markets change the rules. It is not a satisfying principle, philosophically. Markets are supposed to be neutral arenas where participants accept outcomes. But when a single participant threatens to destroy the system itself, regulators have always intervened. On January 7, 1980, COMEX announced what became known as Silver Rule 7. Effective immediately, trading in silver futures would be restricted. Participants could only sell existing positions. They could not take new long positions. Only liquidation orders were permitted for March silver futures contracts. The effect was immediate and deliberate. With buyers locked out, the only way for prices to move was down. The Hunts and their consortium, who had spent months building their position, suddenly found themselves unable to add to it. And the weight of market reality, the understanding that a corner only works if you can keep buying, began to press on the price. Silver began to fall, not immediately, not all at once. The decline was initially orderly. There were days of partial recovery, days of confusion, as market participants tried to understand what the Hunts would do next. What the Hunts did was borrow more money to maintain their futures positions and avoid margin calls. The demands from brokers to put up more cash as the value of their leverage positions fell. The Hunts needed capital. They were borrowing through Batcher Halsey, Stuart Shields, one of the largest brokerage firms in America at the time. They were borrowing through a network of banks in Dallas and New York. The debt was becoming extraordinary. By some estimates, the Hunts had committed to pay for silver at prices that were now far above the market. They were holding positions worth billions of dollars in a market that was in the process of collapsing back toward reality. On the night of March 26, 1980, Bash called the Hunts. They had a margin call due the next morning, a large one. The Hunts could not meet it. Part 7. Silver Thursday. March 27, 1980 began as any ordinary Thursday in the financial markets. By the time trading opened, word was circulating that the Hunts were in trouble. Exactly how much trouble, nobody knew. But the rumors were enough. Silver opened at approximately $15.80, and then it fell. By the close of trading, silver had reached $10.80, a 32% collapse in a single trading session. In the context of a commodity that had been the vehicle for the largest private cornering attempt in financial history, this was not just a market move. It was a catastrophic unwinding. The corner had broken, the spell was gone, and the debt was still there. Back Halsey, Stuart Shields, had outstanding margin calls from the Hunts of approximately $233 million. That was money Bash had effectively lent to the Hunts, money that was now secured against silver that was worth far less than expected. If the Hunts defaulted and their ability to pay was in serious doubt, Back would face losses it could not absorb. And if Bash failed, the contagion would spread. Other firms that had lent to the Hunts or their counterparties would face their own reckoning. The Federal Reserve Chairman, Paul Volcker, was briefed on the situation. What Volcker understood, and what the senior people at the Treasury Department and COMEX also understood, was that this was no longer just the story of two wealthy Texans who had made a catastrophic bet. This was a systemic risk. If the dominoes started falling, the losses could reach into the banking system itself. Volcker called emergency meetings. The major banks were summoned. The question was simple. How do you contain this without causing the very panic you are trying to prevent? Part 8. The Rescue. The The solution was a consortium loan. A group of American banks, including First National Bank of Dallas, First National Bank of Chicago, manufacturers Hanover, and several others, agreed to extend a credit facility of approximately $1.1 billion to the Hunt family. This was not charity. The Hunts had to pledge substantial collateral, oil fields, real estate, other assets accumulated over decades. The terms were severe. The Hunts were effectively handing control of their financial future to their creditors, but the loan achieved its purpose. It prevented the immediate collapse of Bach. It gave the market time to absorb the shock without triggering a banking cascade. The immediate crisis passed. Silver continued to fall. By the end of 1980, it had retreated to approximately $15. By 1982, it was below $10. By 1985, it was back below $6, roughly where it had been before the Hunts began their campaign. The corner was over, the trade had failed, and the Hunts, who had begun 1979 with a fortune estimated by some at $5 billion, were facing ruin. Part 8b. The congressional hearings and the political fallout. Silver Thursday did not just destroy the Hunt fortune. It triggered a political crisis. Congress demanded answers. How had two private individuals accumulated a position so large that its collapse threatened the stability of an American financial institution? Where were the regulators? What had the Commodity Futures Trading Commission been doing while the position built for over a year? In May 1980, the Senate Government Affairs Committee convened hearings on the silver market. The Hunts were called to testify. Nelson Bunker Hunt sat before the Senate committee, large, impassive, accompanied by lawyers, and answered questions in the measured, unhurried tone of a man who had decided long ago that other people's panic was not his problem. He testified that he had purchased silver as an inflation hedge, that his intentions were purely defensive, that he had no understanding that his accumulation would cause the disruption it caused, that he was, in his telling, simply a concerned investor protecting his family's wealth against government monetary policy. The senators found this difficult to believe. The scale of the position, over 100 million troy ounces of physical silver plus enormous futures holdings, was not the action of a defensive investor. It was the action of a market operator. The committee's counsel pressed on the Saudi partnership, on the IMIC arrangements, on the way the position had been structured across multiple entities to avoid triggering position limits. The Hunts were not conceding much. Their lawyers were excellent, and the civil case that would eventually find them guilty was still years away. But the political damage was significant. The image of two wealthy Texas heirs cornering a global commodity market, benefiting from retail panic, from the flight into silver by ordinary Americans trying to protect their savings, while simultaneously threatening the solvency of a major brokerage firm, was not a sympathetic one. Paul Volcker, testifying separately, was measured but clear. The regulatory system had failed to prevent a situation that had put systemic stability at risk. He recommended strengthening position limits. He recommended better coordination between commodity regulators and the Federal Reserve. These recommendations were eventually implemented in pieces over the following decade. The Emergency Credit Control Act of 1980, which had been passed earlier that year as an anti-inflation measure, was invoked to include credit guidelines that would discourage speculative commodity lending. a direct response to the credit that had fueled the Hunt campaign. The financial system had learned a lesson. The question was how long it would remember it. Part 9. The Legal Reckoning. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the federal regulator responsible for overseeing futures markets, had been monitoring the Hunt campaign throughout. In 1985, it filed civil charges. The case wound through the courts. In 1988, a federal jury in Dallas found Nelson Bunker Hunt and William Herbert Hunt guilty of civil conspiracy to manipulate and corner the silver market. They were ordered to pay approximately $134 million in damages. In the same year, both men filed for personal bankruptcy. Nelson Bunker Hunt, who had once been considered one of the wealthiest men in America, who had attended horse races around the world and maintained racing stables on multiple continents, who had funded political causes and religious missions, declared personal assets of insufficient value to cover his debts. He and his brother were banned from trading in futures markets for life. The fortune that H.L. Hunt had built from a poker hand and a lucky oil lease was gone. Not reduced, not diminished. Gone. Their horse racing empire was auctioned. Their assets were pledged to creditors. The details of the Hunt family financial collapse played out in Texas bankruptcy courts through the late 1980s made for grim reading. Nelson Bunker Hunt was once asked, in the aftermath, whether he had any regrets about the silver campaign. He said that $1 billion wasn't what it used to be. Even in defeat, the man was unreachable by ordinary regret. Part 9b. The bankruptcy years. The loan consortium of 1980 bought time. It did not buy salvation. The $1 billion credit facility gave the Hunts a framework to address their most immediate obligations and avoid a fire sale of assets. But the underlying problem did not go away. They had borrowed enormous sums to buy silver at prices that no longer existed. The gap between what they had paid and what the silver was now worth was a deficit that no amount of renegotiation could make disappear. Through the early 1980s, the Hunts tried to restructure. They sold assets. They negotiated with creditors. They applied the considerable resources, legal, financial, political, that came with their family name and their network of connections in Texas business and Republican politics. Bunker Hunt was a generous donor to conservative causes. He had funded right-wing political organizations through the 1970s. He had connections to figures who had connections to the Reagan administration. But none of that helped him in the bankruptcy court. By 1988, when the civil verdict came down, the mathematics had become undeniable. The Hunts filed for personal bankruptcy. The bankruptcy process exposed in court filings what the family had worked for decades to keep private: the true scale of the H.L. Hunt estate, the complex web of trusts and entities through which wealth had been distributed, and the extent to which the silver campaign had consumed not just the profits of the 1970s, but capital that stretched back to the East Texas oil fields of 1930. The racing stables, Bunker Hunt, had been one of the most prominent thoroughbred horse breeders in the world, with operations in Kentucky, England, France, and Australia, were sold. His famous horses crossed the auction block. Exceller, a horse that had beaten Triple Crown winner Seattle Slew and two-time Horse of the Year, affirmed in the same race in 1978, had been part of a racing empire that was now being dismantled piece by piece. The ranch properties in Texas, some accumulated over decades by H.L. Hunt himself, were pledged to creditors. The Hunt family's private jet, their art, their business interests, All of it was examined, valued, and committed to the debt resolution process. It was one of the most spectacular reversals of private fortune in American history. And in the middle of it, Nelson Bunker Hunt maintained, to anyone who asked, the serene conviction of a man who still believed he had been fundamentally right. He had not been wrong about inflation, he would say. He had been wrong about timing. He had been wrong about leverage. He had been wrong to underestimate the willingness of regulators to change the rules mid-game. But the underlying idea that paper money was unreliable and hard assets were real remained, in his view, as valid after the disaster as it had been before it. This was not entirely irrational. Silver, after all, does preserve value over long enough time horizons. Gold does. Hard assets do. The problem with the Hunt thesis was never the insight. It was the implementation. Part 10. The silver market and why it almost worked. In retrospect, the Hunt silver scheme was both audacious and almost rational. Almost. The thesis was not wrong. Inflation was real. The dollar's purchasing power was genuinely declining. Hard assets had historically preserved value through inflationary periods. Silver, specifically, was under-owned and underpriced relative to gold. Where the Hunts miscalculated was in their belief that the market would not fight back. Every market participant who had sold silver short, who had bet prices would stay low or fall, was a counterparty who now had every incentive in the world to stop the Hunt corner. They lobbied COMEX, they called regulators, they organized, and when the regulators changed the rules, the mechanism of the corner was broken. The other miscalculation was leverage. The Hunts were rich, but they were not rich enough to own the world's silver supply without borrowing. And leverage means that the day you cannot meet a margin call is the day the entire structure collapses. It does not matter how right you might eventually be proven. If your creditor demands money you do not have, the position must be liquidated at whatever price the market offers. This is the central lesson the Hunt story teaches about the nature of concentrated, leveraged bets in commodity markets. You can be directionally right. You can be making a fundamentally sound investment thesis, and you can still lose everything if you are leveraged and the market has time, patience, and regulatory power that you do not. Part 11. The legacy. The Hunt silver corner changed markets in ways that persist to this day. Position limits, rules restricting how large a single entity's position in a futures market can be, were strengthened substantially in the aftermath of Silver Thursday. The regulatory architecture of commodity markets was overhauled. The relationship between the Federal Reserve, the Treasury, and commodity regulators was formalized in ways designed to prevent a single private actor from threatening systemic stability. The COMEX silver futures market, where so much of the Hunt drama played out, became the primary global price discovery mechanism for silver, and the rules governing it were shaped specifically by the events of 1979 and 1980. The price of silver, meanwhile, did not recover the Hunt's $49 peak for 30 years. It was not until 2011, in a different inflationary environment with different buyers, that silver briefly touched near the old record before falling back. The Hunt brothers' names are still used in financial circles as shorthand for a particular kind of hubris, the belief that private capital can overwhelm market forces indefinitely, that leverage can substitute for judgment, and that governments will allow their financial systems to be held hostage by individual actors pursuing private agendas. It is a shorthand worth knowing. because the impulse the hunts embodied, the certainty that the system is rigged, that hard assets are the answer, that the ordinary rules of risk do not apply to those with sufficient conviction, is not unique to the 1970s. It is a human impulse. It emerges in every era. It wears different clothes in different decades. Sometimes it manifests as tulip bulbs, sometimes as dot-com shares, sometimes as leveraged silver futures, sometimes as cryptocurrency, sometimes as something no one has yet invented. The mechanism is always the same: a genuine insight taken to a leveraged extreme, combined with the belief that the rules of market physics can be escaped. They cannot. Nelson Bunker Hunt died in October 2014 at the age of 88. His estate, by then, was modest. He had lived long enough to watch silver fall back to ordinary prices, to see the fortune he inherited and gambled rebuild itself partially through the 1990s before the bankruptcy proceedings finished their work, and to live out his final decades in circumstances far removed from the scale of what he had once commanded. He had, at the peak, reportedly controlled more physical silver than any private individual in history. And in the end, the market took it back. The market always takes it back. Epilogue. What Silver Thursday tells us every generation of investors faces a version of this story. The details change, the commodities change, the technology changes, the participants change, but the structure is always the same. A genuine problem, in the Hunt's case, real inflation destroying the real value of paper money, leads a small group of people to a real insight. This asset is undervalued. This trend is real. We understand something the market does not yet understand. From that insight, they build a position. The position works for a while. The price moves in their direction. They add more leverage. They bring in partners. They grow confident, then overconfident, then certain. And then the mechanism breaks. Not because they were wrong about the underlying insight. The dollar did lose value. Inflation was real. Silver was genuinely a useful hedge against inflation in a moderate, sensible position size. The mechanism breaks because concentration and leverage turn a correct insight into a brittle structure. And brittle structures shatter when the wind changes direction. The greatest financial disasters in history are not stories of people who were wrong. They are stories of people who were right, but not careful enough to survive being right. Nelson Bunker Hunt understood money. He understood markets. He understood that paper currencies carried real risks. He just forgot to leave himself room to be wrong about the timing. And in markets, timing is everything. You can be right about the destination, but if you cannot survive the journey, you never arrive. That is the lesson of Silver Thursday. That is the lesson of the Hunt brothers. And it is worth remembering every time you find yourself holding a position that you are absolutely certain is correct. Final reflections. The 3 errors. Looking back at the Hunt-Silver campaign with the clarity of distance, 3 errors stand out above all others. The first was the error of scale. There is a kind of financial position where being right and being too right are equally dangerous. If the Hunts had accumulated a large but not dominant position in silver, perhaps 20 to 30 million ounces rather than 100 million, they would have profited handsomely from the inflationary environment of the late 1970s, preserved their families' wealth, and remained ordinary, if very wealthy, investors. It was the desire to own the market, rather than profit from the market, that made their position a target. This error of scale is more common than people recognize. It appears whenever an investor stops asking, "What is the right position size for this thesis?" and starts asking, "How much of this can I possibly buy?" The first question respects the market. The second question tries to replace it. The second error was the error of leverage. The Hunts were unquestionably wealthy. Their family fortune at the outset of the campaign was enormous by any ordinary standard. But they were not wealthy enough to corner the global silver market without borrowing. And borrowed money imposes a constraint that no other constraint does. It has a schedule. You can be illiquid on your own terms. You can be wrong on your own terms. You can wait out a market dislocation on your own terms. If the asset is yours and no one can compel you to sell it before you choose to. The moment you borrow to fund your position, you surrender that patience to your creditor. Your creditor's timeline, not yours, determines when the position must be resolved. The Huns discovered this on the night of March 26, 1980. Bash called. The margin was due, and no amount of conviction about the long-term value of silver changed what happened the next day. The third error was the error of certainty. Bunker Hunt was, by all accounts, genuinely and deeply certain that his thesis was correct. The dollar was being debased. Inflation was real. Hard assets would preserve value. Silver was under-owned and underpriced relative to gold. He was right about all of this. What he was not right about was his ability to predict the mechanism and timing by which the market would recognize what he knew. And he was profoundly wrong about his ability to force that recognition through accumulated buying power. This is the most dangerous form of being right. The certainty that leads you to size your position as if the outcome is already determined, as if the only question is how much you can accumulate before the inevitable profit arrives. Markets are not obligated to agree with your correct thesis on your timeline. They can remain wrong, from your perspective, for longer than your leverage allows you to wait. John Maynard Keynes, writing decades before the Hunt campaign, articulated this principle precisely. The market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. It is the law that governs the wreckage of 1,000 financial campaigns, from the South Sea bubble of 1720 to the Hunt Silver Corner of 1980 to the crypto collapses of the 2020s. The thesis may be right. The trade may still kill you. This is what Nelson Bunker Hunt, for all his intelligence and ambition and genuine financial insight, ultimately failed to reckon with. And it is why, on a Thursday in March 1980, one of the greatest private fortunes in American history began its long, irreversible dissolution. Not because the world was not inflating, not because silver was not a real asset, but because the clock on borrowed money had no patience for being right eventually. It required being right immediately. And the market, as it always does in the end, had other plans.